The needle slipped through fabric like a whisper, and Clara Ashford's fingers moved with practiced precision even as her stomach growled loud enough to echo in the tiny back room that served as both workshop and bedroom. She had been sewing for Mrs. Henderson since dawn, putting the final touches on a silk evening gown the color of summer roses, and now the afternoon sun slanted through the single window, casting golden light across the emerald green fabric she wore, the same rough cotton work dress she had owned for 3 years. Clara made beautiful things for other women, transforming bolts of fabric into dreams of lace and satin. But she had never once made herself a proper dress, not even from the scraps left over after cutting patterns. Every cent she earned went toward keeping the small shop afloat after her father died 2 winters ago, leaving her with nothing but his dressmaking tools and a mountain of debts to the bank. The bell above the shop door chimed, and Clara set down Mrs. Henderson's gown carefully before rising from her stool. Her knees protested, stiff from hours of sitting, and she smoothed down her worn dress before stepping through the curtain that separated her workspace from the front of the shop. A man stood just inside the doorway, hat in his hands, and Clara's breath caught in her throat at the sight of him. He was tall, with broad shoulders that strained against his chambray shirt, and his sun-bronzed face bore the marks of a life spent outdoors. Dark hair fell across his forehead, and when he looked up at her, his eyes were the deep brown of rich earth after rain. Dust covered his boots and the lower portion of his denim trousers, and a worn leather gun belt sat low on his hips, marking him clearly as a working cowboy rather than one of the town dandies who sometimes wandered in looking for fancy waistcoats. "Good afternoon," Clara said, trying to keep her voice steady and professional despite the way her heart had started beating faster. "How may I help you?" The cowboy shifted his weight from one foot to the other, looking uncomfortable in the feminine space filled with bolts of fabric and dress forms draped in half-finished garments. "Name's Pierce Morgan. I work out at the Double R Ranch about 10 miles west of Rawlins. My sister's getting married in 6 weeks, and she needs a wedding dress. Mrs. Henderson in town said you're the best dressmaker in all of Wyoming." Clara felt warmth spread across her cheeks at the compliment, even secondhand as it was. "Mrs. Henderson is very kind. I would be happy to make your sister's dress. When can she come in for measurements?" Pierce Morgan's expression shifted, something like regret crossing his features. "That's the problem, miss. Sarah's laid up with a broken leg. Horse threw her 3 weeks ago, and the doctor says she cannot travel for at least another month. But she has her heart set on a proper wedding dress, and I thought maybe you could come out to the ranch. I know it is asking a lot, but I would pay for your time and travel both." Clara hesitated, her mind racing through the implications. It was not exactly proper for an unmarried woman to travel alone with a man she had just met, even for business purposes, but the commission for a wedding dress would help tremendously with this month's rent. Besides, she would be working with his sister, not with him, and the ranch was only a few hours away by wagon. "I suppose I could make the trip," she said slowly. "I would need to take measurements and discuss fabric choices with your sister. When would be convenient? Tomorrow?" Pierce asked, hope lighting his features in a way that made him even more handsome. "I could pick you up at first light, have you back before dark. Sarah's so worried about the dress, it would mean the world to her to get started." Clara found herself nodding before she had fully thought it through. "Tomorrow, then. I will prepare my supplies this evening." Pierce's smile transformed his entire face, and Clara felt something flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with business. "Thank you, miss. I truly appreciate it. What's your name, if you do not mind me asking?" "Clara Ashford." "Miss Ashford," Pierce said, testing out her name like he was tasting something sweet. I will be here at dawn. Thank you again." He settled his hat back on his head and left, and Clara stood alone in her shop, wondering what she had just agreed to, and why the prospect of seeing Pierce Morgan again made her feel like she was standing on the edge of something vast and unknown. That evening, Clara packed her supplies carefully into her father's old leather satchel. She included her measuring tape, pins, needles, several spools of thread in various colors, her best scissors, and the small notebook where she sketched dress designs and recorded measurements. She also packed the few samples of fabric she kept on hand, so Sarah Morgan could see the textures and weights of different materials, though the bulk of the fabric would need to be ordered from the supplier in Cheyenne once they settled on a design. Sleep came fitfully that night. Clara lay on her narrow cot in the back room, listening to the sounds of Rollins settling into darkness outside her window. Dogs barked in the distance, and somewhere down the street, a piano played a melancholy tune that drifted through the warm May air. She thought about Pierce Morgan's kind eyes and the way his hands had worried the brim of his hat, showing that he cared deeply about making his sister happy. There was something solid about him, something dependable, and Clara found herself curious about what kind of life he led out on the range. When dawn painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, Clara was already dressed and waiting, her hair pinned up neatly and her satchel by the door. She had put on her best dress, though best was a relative term when she only owned two, and this one was merely a slightly less faded version of the one she had worn yesterday. The green cotton had been washed so many times that it felt soft as butter against her skin, but the color had dulled to something between sage and moss, and the hem bore careful mending where it had torn on a nail last winter. The sound of wagon wheels on the dirt street brought Clara to her window, and she watched as Pierce Morgan pulled up in front of her shop driving a sturdy farm wagon pulled by two chestnut horses. He had cleaned up since yesterday, his face freshly shaven and his shirt looking like it had been pressed, though he still wore the same gun, belt, and boots. Clara grabbed her satchel and locked the shop door behind her, hanging a sign that read "Closed for business appointments" in the window. "Morning, Miss Ashford," Pierce greeted her, jumping down from the wagon seat with easy grace. He took her satchel and offered his hand to help her up onto the bench. His palm was calloused and warm, and Clara felt that strange flutter again as their hands touched. "Good morning, Mr. Morgan," she replied, settling herself on the seat and arranging her skirts around her legs. The morning air still held a hint of night's coolness, and she was glad she had brought her shawl. Pierce climbed up beside her and took up the reins, clicking his tongue at the horses. They moved forward at a steady pace, leaving Rollins behind as they headed west toward the open range. The town was just beginning to wake, smoke rising from chimneys as families prepared breakfast, and the smell of baking bread drifted from the bakery on Main Street. "It is a beautiful morning," Clara offered, unsure of what to say and feeling suddenly shy in Pierce's presence. "It is," Pierce agreed. "This is my favorite time of year in Wyoming. Everything's green from the spring rains, and it is not yet hot enough to bake your brain in your skull." Clara laughed at his blunt description, and she felt some of her nervousness ease. "How long have you worked at the Double R?" "Going on 8 years now," Pierce said, guiding the horses onto a rutted trail that led away from the main road. "I started as a green kid who did not know which end of a cow was which, and the foreman took pity on me and taught me the trade. Saved up enough to buy a small piece of land adjoining the ranch, and I have been building a house there when I have time. Slow going, but it is mine." There was pride in his voice, and Clara understood that feeling of working toward something that belonged to you alone. That must be satisfying, building something with your own hands. "It is," Pierce said, glancing at her with those warm brown eyes. "I imagine you know that feeling, creating beautiful things the way you do." Clara felt her cheeks warm. "I suppose I do, though I never thought of it quite that way. I just do what my father taught me." Sarah said Mrs. Henderson's dress for the governor's ball last year was the finest thing anyone in Rawlins had ever seen. Said you had stitched tiny flowers into the bodice that looked so real you could almost smell them. Mrs. Henderson was kind enough to let me try some embroidery techniques I had been wanting to practice, Clara said, pleased that her work had been noticed and appreciated. "Your sister must be excited about her wedding. What is her husband to be like?" Pierce's expression softened. "Thomas Reeves, good man, works the neighboring ranch. Known him since we were boys. He has been sweet on Sarah since we were all in school together, and finally worked up the courage to ask her to marry him last Christmas. I could not be happier for them both." They talked easily as the wagon rolled across the Wyoming landscape, and Clara found herself relaxing into the conversation. Pierce told her about life on the ranch, about the spring roundup, and the challenge of keeping cattle safe from predators and thieves. He spoke about his plans for his house, describing the front porch he wanted to build where he could sit in the evenings and watch the sunset. Clara shared stories about her father's dressmaking business, about the women who came to her shop with dreams in their eyes and pictures torn from magazines, wanting to be transformed into someone new for a special occasion. "What about you?" Pierce asked after they had been traveling for over an hour. The ranch buildings were visible in the distance now, a collection of structures nestled in a green valley with mountains rising blue and majestic beyond. "You ever make dresses for yourself?" Clara looked down at her faded green work dress and felt a pang of something she could not quite name. "No, there never seems to be time or money for that. The fabric I buy goes to fill orders, and what is left over I sell to make ends meet." Pierce was quiet for a moment, and Clara worried she had said too much, revealed too much of her struggles. But when he spoke, his voice was gentle. "That seems a shame, that someone who makes such beautiful things for others does not have beautiful things for herself." Before Clara could respond, they were pulling into the ranch yard, and a young woman with Pierce's same dark hair came hobbling out of the main house on crutches, her left leg wrapped in bandages and splints. She could not have been more than 19, and her face lit up with joy when she saw the wagon. "Pierce, you brought her. Oh, Miss Ashford, I cannot tell you how grateful I am that you came all this way." Clara climbed down from the wagon, and Pierce appeared at her elbow with her satchel, his hand steadying her even though she did not really need the help. Sarah Morgan moved forward on her crutches with surprising speed, and her enthusiasm was infectious. "Please, come inside. I have been collecting pictures and ideas, and I have so many thoughts about what I want. Thomas says I am driving everyone mad with wedding talk, but I just want everything to be perfect." The Morgan home was modest but comfortable, with wide plank floors and cheerful curtains at the windows. Sarah led Clara to a sitting room where a table had been cleared and covered with magazine clippings, sketches, and notes written in enthusiastic, looping handwriting. Pierce excused himself to see to the horses, and Clara was left alone with Sarah, who immediately launched into an excited explanation of her wedding dress vision. "I want something elegant but not too fussy," Sarah said, flipping through her collection of images. "Thomas and I are getting married in the church in Rawlins, and then we are having a celebration here at the ranch. I want to feel beautiful, but I also want to be able to move and dance. And I love lace, but not too much lace. Does that make sense?" Clara smiled, pulling out her notebook and pencil. "It makes perfect sense. Let me ask you some questions, and we will figure out exactly what you want." They spent the next 2 hours discussing every detail of the dress. Clara took Sarah's measurements, working carefully around the splinted leg, and sketched several design options based on Sarah's preferences. They talked about necklines and sleeve lengths, about the drape of the skirt, and whether to include a small train. Sarah wanted something romantic and timeless, and Clara found herself getting caught up in the creative challenge of designing the perfect gown. "I think a fitted bodice with a sweetheart neckline would be lovely on you," Clara said, showing Sarah her latest sketch. "And we could do 3/4-length sleeves with lace trim, then a full skirt that falls from the natural waist. Simple but elegant, and you will be able to move easily." Sarah's eyes filled with happy tears. "Oh, Clara, may I call you Clara? It is perfect." "That is exactly what I have been seeing in my mind but could not describe." "Of course you may call me Clara," Clara said warmly. She had not had many friends growing up, too busy helping her father in the shop, and then too busy keeping the business afloat after he died. But there was something immediately likable about Sarah Morgan, an openness and warmth that invited friendship. "Now for fabric," Clara said, pulling out her samples. "For a wedding dress, I would suggest silk or satin for the main gown, with lace overlays if you want them. I have a supplier in Cheyenne who carries beautiful materials." Sarah touched each sample reverently, her fingers lingering on a cream-colored silk that caught the light like liquid pearl. "This one. This is the one. It is perfect." "Excellent choice," Clara said, making notes. "I will need to order it along with the lace and thread. It should arrive within 2 weeks, and then I can begin construction. I will need you to come into town for at least one fitting, preferably 2, to make sure everything fits perfectly." "I will be there," Sarah promised. "Even if I have to hobble in on these crutches. Thomas can drive me." The door opened, and Pierce appeared carrying a tray with sandwiches and lemonade. "Thought you ladies might be hungry. It is past noon." Clara realized with surprise that she had been so absorbed in working with Sarah that she had lost track of time entirely. Her stomach reminded her that she had only eaten a piece of bread before dawn, and she accepted a sandwich gratefully. "Thank you, Pierce," Sarah said, beaming at her brother. "Clara is going to make me the most beautiful wedding dress in all of Wyoming. Wait until you see her sketches." Pierce looked at the drawings spread across the table, and his expression grew thoughtful. "I am sure you will be beautiful, Sarah. Thomas is a lucky man." They ate together, and Clara found herself included in the easy banter between brother and sister. Pierce teased Sarah gently about her habit of collecting stray cats, and Sarah gave back as good as she got, mentioning that Pierce had a habit of forgetting to come in for dinner when he was working on his house project. It was clear they cared deeply for each other, and Clara felt a pang of loneliness for the family she no longer had. "Clara, would you like to see the property where Pierce is building his house?" Sarah asked suddenly. "It is not far, just over the ridge, and the view is spectacular." "I would go with you, but these crutches make hiking impossible." "I do not want to intrude," Clara began, but Pierce was already standing. "It is no intrusion," he said. "I would be happy to show you if you are interested. We have time before we need to head back to Rawlins." Clara found herself agreeing, and soon she and Pierce were walking along a well-worn path that led away from the main ranch buildings. The afternoon sun was warm on her shoulders, and wildflowers bloomed in profusion along the trail, painting the landscape in purples and yellows and reds. Pierce walked beside her, matching his longer stride to her pace, and pointed out landmarks as they went. "That is where the spring feed starts," he said, indicating a line of green that marked a creek's path through the valley. "And over there, you can see where the cattle like to gather in the shade during the heat of summer." They crested a small rise, and Clara stopped in her tracks. Before them stretched a vista that took her breath away. The land rolled out in gentle waves of green and gold, and in the distance, the mountains rose like ancient guardians, their peaks still touched with snow even in late May. And there, in a sheltered spot with trees on three sides and a clear view of the valley, stood the frame of a house. It was not large, but it was well proportioned, and Clara could see the care that had gone into its construction. The foundation was solid stone, and the frame was already up, showing the outline of rooms and windows. Lumber was stacked neatly nearby, and tools hung from pegs on a temporary shelter. "It is wonderful," Clara breathed, walking closer. "Pierce, you are building this yourself." "Mostly," he admitted, following her. "Some of the other ranch hands help when they have time, and I hired a carpenter to make sure the frame was square and solid. But yes, most of it is my own work. Slow going, since I can only work on it during my days off and after my ranch duties are done. But I will get there eventually." Clara walked through the frame, imagining walls and windows, picturing how the light would fall in the main room and how the kitchen would look with a stove and table. "You said you wanted a porch." "Right here," Pierce said, moving to stand beside her at what would become the front of the house. "Wide enough for chairs and maybe a swing. I have always thought a house should have a good porch, a place to sit and think at the end of the day." "It sounds peaceful," Clara said softly. She could almost see it, this house filled with warmth and life, and she felt a strange ache in her chest for something she had never known she wanted. "Can I ask you something?" Pierce said, and there was a hesitancy in his voice that made Clara turn to look at him fully. "Of course. Why do you not make yourself dresses? Sarah mentioned it earlier, and I have been wondering. You have such a talent, and it seems like you should have fine things too." Clara looked away, embarrassed to admit the truth, but somehow unable to lie to those honest brown eyes. "Because I cannot afford the fabric. Every bolt I buy is spoken for, ordered for a specific customer. And the scraps that are left are never enough for a full dress, at least not one that would be suitable for anything other than working in the shop. I send those scraps to the church for their quilting circle." "But surely you could order extra fabric for yourself," Pierce pressed gently. "I could if I had the money," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But my father left debts when he died, and I have been paying them down slowly. The bank owns more of my shop than I do. Every cent goes toward keeping the doors open and keeping a roof over my head. There is nothing left over for luxuries like new dresses for myself." Pierce was quiet for a long moment, and Clara wished she had not said so much. It was mortifying to admit her poverty to someone she barely knew, especially someone like Pierce Morgan, who was clearly working toward a better future. "I am sorry," Pierce said finally. "That must be difficult, creating beauty for others while denying yourself." "It is what it is," Clara said, trying to sound matter-of-fact. "And I should not complain. I have my father's skills and my own two hands, which is more than many people have." "You are very strong," Pierce said, and there was admiration in his voice that made Clara's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. They walked back to the ranch house in comfortable silence, and Clara found herself acutely aware of Pierce's presence beside her. He was solid and dependable, and there was something about him that made her feel safe in a way she had not felt since her father was alive. It was dangerous, this feeling, because she could not afford to let herself hope for things that were beyond her reach. Pierce Morgan was building a future for himself, and a dressmaker drowning in debt was not part of that picture. The ride back to Rawlins seemed shorter than the morning journey, perhaps because Clara was lost in thought. Pierce pointed out a herd of antelope in the distance and told her about a mountain lion that had been spotted near the ranch last week, but Clara only half heard him. She was thinking about the fabric she would need to order for Sarah's dress, and about the way Pierce's eyes had looked when he talked about his house, and about the strange, empty feeling in her chest that had started when she left his building site. When they reached her shop, the sun was dipping toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Pierce helped her down from the wagon and carried her satchel to the door. "Thank you for today," he said. "Sarah is so happy, and it is good to see her excited about something other than her broken leg." "It was my pleasure," Clara said honestly. "Your sister is wonderful, and I am looking forward to making her dress." Pierce hesitated, as if he wanted to say something more, but then he simply tipped his hat. "I will be in town in a few days. Maybe I could stop by and see how the plans are coming." "I would like that," Clara said, and she meant it more than she should. She watched him drive away, then let herself into the dark shop. It felt emptier than usual after the warmth of the Morgan home and the beauty of Pierce's land. Clara lit a lamp and sat down at her work table, pulling out her notes and sketches from the day. She had Sarah's measurements and her fabric preferences, and tomorrow she would send a telegram to her supplier in Cheyenne to order what she needed. But tonight, she found herself sketching something different. Her pencil moved across a fresh page, drawing lines and curves that took shape into a dress. Not Sarah's wedding gown, but something else entirely. A simple day dress with a fitted bodice and full skirts, the kind of dress a woman might wear to church or to a social gathering. The kind of dress Clara had never owned. She sketched details, adding small touches that pleased her eye. A bit of lace at the collar, buttons down the front, sleeves that would be comfortable for work but pretty enough for special occasions. She imagined it in different colors, blue like the Wyoming sky, yellow like the wildflowers on Pierce's land, red like the sunset she had just witnessed. Then she closed her notebook with a sigh and went back to finishing Mrs. Henderson's gown. Dreams were lovely, but they did not pay the bills. The next morning, Clara sent her telegram to Cheyenne and received a reply within hours. The fabric she needed for Sarah's dress was in stock and would arrive by train in 10 days. The cost was substantial, and Clara would need to ask Sarah for a deposit before placing the final order, but that was standard practice for custom work. She was working on a mending job for the saloon keeper's wife when the shop bell chimed. Clara looked up, expecting to see one of her regular customers, but instead Pierce Morgan stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands and an uncertain expression on his face. "Mr. Morgan," Clara said, rising from her stool with surprise. "I did not expect to see you so soon." "I know," Pierce said, "but I was thinking about something and I could not let it rest. Miss Ashford, may I speak plainly?" "Of course," Clara said, her heart beginning to beat faster. Pierce took a deep breath. "It bothers me that you spend your days making beautiful things for other people but have nothing beautiful for yourself, and I would like to do something about that if you will let me." Clara stared at him, not understanding. "I do not follow. I want to buy you fabric," Pierce said in a rush. "Fabric for you to make dresses for yourself, any kind you want, any color, as much as you need." Clara felt the color drain from her face. "Mr. Morgan, I cannot possibly accept such a gift. It would not be proper." "Why not?" Pierce asked, and there was genuine confusion in his voice. "I have money saved from my work, and I want to spend it on something worthwhile. You deserve to have nice things, Clara. You work so hard and you give so much to others. Let someone do something for you." "But we barely know each other," Clara protested, even as part of her longed to say yes, to have the beautiful fabric she dreamed about, to wear something other than her two faded work dresses. "Then let us get to know each other better," Pierce said, moving closer. "I would like to call on you properly if you are willing. I know it is fast, but I feel drawn to you in a way I have never experienced before. From the moment I walked into this shop, I have not been able to stop thinking about you." Clara's breath caught. No one had ever spoken to her this way, with such raw honesty and intention. She had assumed she would spend her life alone, too busy with work to find a husband, too poor to attract anyone worthwhile. And here was Pierce Morgan, strong and kind and handsome, saying he wanted to court her. "I do not know what to say," she whispered. "Say yes," Pierce urged. "Say yes to the fabric and say yes to letting me take you to dinner tomorrow evening. Just give me a chance to show you that you deserve good things." Clara looked into his warm brown eyes and saw sincerity there, and hope, and something else that made her pulse race. She thought about the empty years stretching ahead of her, working alone in her shop, making beauty for everyone but herself. She thought about Pierce's land and his half-built house and the way he had talked about porches and sunsets. And she thought about the sketches in her notebook, all those dresses she had drawn but never made. "Yes," she heard herself say. "Yes to dinner. But Pierce, the fabric, it is too much." "It is not enough," Pierce said firmly. "Clara, I want to do this. Let me, please." And somehow, looking at him standing there so earnest and determined, Clara could not find it in herself to refuse. "All right," she said softly. "All right." Pierce's face broke into a grin that transformed him completely. "Truly, you will let me?" "Yes," Clara said, laughing despite herself. "But I choose the fabric and you do not argue with my choices." "Deal," Pierce said immediately. "When can we go to the fabric store?" "The general store carries some fabric," Clara said. "We could go now if you have time." Pierce offered her his arm like a gentleman escorting a fine lady, and Clara set aside her mending and locked the shop door behind her. They walked together down the main street of Rawlins, and Clara was aware of curious glances from townspeople who saw them together. Let them look, she thought with a surge of defiance. She had spent years being careful and proper and self-denying, and for once in her life, she was going to accept something good. The general store was cool and dim after the bright sunshine outside, and Clara led Pierce to the section where bolts of fabric were stacked on shelves reaching nearly to the ceiling. There was not the selection she could get from her Cheyenne supplier, but there were still dozens of choices in every color imaginable. Clara's hands trembled as she reached for a bolt of deep blue cotton, the color of the sky at twilight. "This one," she said, "for a day dress." "Good," Pierce said. "What else?" Clara selected a bolt of yellow muslin, bright as sunshine, and then a deep green that reminded her of pine trees. She added a soft rose-colored cotton and a practical gray that would be perfect for everyday wear. Pierce nodded at each choice, and when Clara hesitated over a bolt of burgundy silk, he pulled it down from the shelf himself. "This too," he said, "for something special." "Pierce, it is silk," Clara protested. "It is expensive." "I do not care," Pierce said stubbornly. "You need something fine, something that makes you feel beautiful." Clara looked at the burgundy silk, the way it caught the light and shimmered like wine. She had never owned anything made of silk, and the thought of wearing something so lovely made her chest ache with longing. "All right," she whispered. "The silk too." They carried their selections to the counter, where Mr. Blackwell, the store owner, watched with raised eyebrows. "Miss Ashford, Mr. Morgan, that is quite a lot of fabric." "I will need enough of each for a full dress," Clara said, trying to sound businesslike. 5 yards of each cotton and muslin and 7 yards of the silk." Mr. Blackwell began measuring and cutting, and the pile of fabric grew on the counter. When he announced the total, Clara nearly gasped at the sum, but Pierce pulled out his wallet without hesitation and counted out the bills. "And I will need thread to match each one," Clara added, "and new needles and buttons for the blue and the yellow." "Of course," Mr. Blackwell said, gathering the supplies. He wrapped everything carefully in brown paper and tied it with string, and Pierce gathered the packages under his arm like they weighed nothing. They walked back to Clara's shop in silence, and Clara felt dazed by what had just happened. She now owned more fabric than she had ever possessed at one time, fabric in beautiful colors that she had chosen just for herself. It felt like a dream, and she was afraid to speak in case she woke up. "Thank you," she finally managed when they reached her shop door. "Pierce, I do not even know how to thank you properly." "You do not need to thank me," Pierce said, setting the packages down inside the door. "I wanted to do this. Now, about that dinner tomorrow, would 6 o'clock suit you?" "Yes," Clara said, her mind already spinning with the realization that she now had fabric to make herself a dress for the occasion. 6 o'clock would be perfect. Pierce tipped his hat and left, and Clara stood alone among her packages, overwhelmed by emotion. She unpacked the fabric slowly, running her hands over each piece, marveling at the textures and colors. The burgundy silk was even more beautiful up close, and she imagined a dress with a fitted bodice and full skirts, something elegant enough to wear to Sarah's wedding or to church on Sunday. But first, she needed something for dinner tomorrow. Clara pulled out the deep blue cotton and spread it across her work table. She had just enough time to make a simple dress if she worked through the night. And suddenly, she wanted nothing more than to show Pierce that his gift had been worthwhile, that she could transform this fabric into something lovely. Clara worked through the afternoon and into the evening, her needle flying through the cloth with practiced precision. She had made so many dresses that the process was almost automatic, her hands knowing exactly where each piece should go and how each seam should lie. But this was different because this dress was for her, and every stitch felt like an act of rebellion against all the years of denial and sacrifice. She created a fitted bodice with a modest neckline, added sleeves that reached just past her elbows, and cut the skirt full enough to move easily but fitted enough to show her figure. She used some of the new buttons Pierce had bought, small white ones that contrasted prettily with the blue fabric. As the dress took shape, Clara felt something shift inside her, like a door opening onto a room she had forgotten existed. When midnight came and went, Clara was still sewing by lamplight, her eyes burning with tiredness but her heart singing with satisfaction. She finally finished as dawn painted the windows with pale light, and she held up the completed dress with trembling hands. It was beautiful, truly beautiful, and it was hers. Clara allowed herself 3 hours of sleep on her cot, then woke and washed with cold water from her basin. She brushed and repinned her hair, trying to tame the brown curls that always seemed to escape their pins. Then, with reverent care, she put on her new blue dress. It fit perfectly, of course, because she had made it for her own measurements. But seeing herself in the dress was different than she had imagined. The blue brought out the color in her hazel eyes, making them look more green than brown. The fitted bodice showed that she had a figure beneath her shapeless work clothes, and the skirt swayed prettily when she moved. Clara stared at her reflection in her small mirror and barely recognized herself. She felt beautiful. The day passed in a blur of excitement and nervousness. Clara worked on Sarah's dress plans, finalizing the order to send to Cheyenne, and tried not to watch the clock too obsessively. When 6 o'clock finally arrived, she was ready, wearing her new blue dress and trying to calm her racing heart. Pierce arrived exactly on time, and the expression on his face when he saw her made every hour of midnight sewing worth it. His eyes widened, and he stood frozen in her doorway for a long moment before finding his voice. "Clara, you look incredible. The dress, it is beautiful." "I made it from the blue fabric you bought," Clara said, feeling shy suddenly. "I worked on it all night. I wanted to have something new for tonight. "You made that in one night?" Pierce asked, amazed. "You truly are talented." He offered his arm, and they walked together to the hotel restaurant, the nicest dining establishment in Rawlins. Clara had never eaten there before. It was far too expensive for someone in her circumstances. But Pierce held the door open for her like she was a fine lady, and the hostess led them to a table near the window. Over dinner, they talked easily, the conversation flowing like they had known each other for years rather than days. Pierce told her about his childhood in Colorado, how his family had moved to Wyoming when he was 12, seeking better opportunities. His father had died young, killed in a mining accident, and Pierce had started working to support his mother and younger sister. His mother had passed away 5 years ago, and now it was just him and Sarah. Clara shared her own story, about growing up in her father's dressmaking shop, learning the trade from him while other girls were learning to dance and flirt. Her mother had died when Clara was born, and it had always been just her and her father, two people against the world, until consumption took him 2 winters past and left her alone. "We are both orphans then," Pierce said softly. "Both of us trying to build something new from what we have left." "Yes," Clara agreed. "Though you are doing a much better job of it than I am. At least you are building up instead of just trying to stay afloat." "You are doing more than staying afloat," Pierce insisted. "You are creating beauty and making people happy. That matters, Clara. That matters more than you know." They talked until the restaurant began closing, and then Pierce walked Clara back to her shop through the warm May night. The streets were quiet, and overhead, stars scattered across the dark sky like diamonds on velvet. At her door, Pierce took both her hands in his. "I would like to see you again, as often as you will allow it." "I would like that too," Clara said, and she realized it was true. She wanted to see Pierce Morgan again and again. She wanted to learn everything about him, wanted to hear his voice and see his smile and feel this strange lightness in her chest that appeared whenever he was near. Pierce leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and kissed her softly on the forehead. It was chaste and respectful, but it sent warmth flooding through Clara's entire body. "Good night, Clara," he whispered. "Good night, Pierce." Over the following weeks, Pierce came to town as often as his ranch duties allowed. Sometimes he stopped by the shop in the afternoon, bringing fresh bread from the ranch cook or wildflowers he had picked on the range. Other times he took Clara to dinner, and once they went to a town social where they danced until Clara's feet ached and her face hurt from smiling. Clara made herself more dresses, using the fabric Pierce had bought. She created the yellow day dress and the green one, and she started on the burgundy silk gown, taking extra care with every detail because this one was special. She also worked on Sarah's wedding dress, and the cream-colored silk arrived from Cheyenne exactly when promised. It was every bit as beautiful as the sample had suggested, and Clara poured all her skill into creating a gown worthy of Sarah's big day. Sarah came to town for her first fitting, hobbling on crutches but healing well. The leg splint had been removed, though she still needed to be careful and could not put her full weight on the injured limb. Thomas Reeves drove her in, a quiet, solid young man with kind eyes and an obvious devotion to his future wife. He waited in the shop's front room while Clara worked with Sarah in the back, and Clara could hear him and Pierce talking through the curtain, their voices a low rumble punctuated by occasional laughter. "Oh, Clara, it is perfect," Sarah breathed when she saw the partially completed dress. "Even better than I imagined." "We still have more work to do," Clara cautioned, pinning adjustments. "But yes, it is coming together nicely." "Pierce seems very happy lately," Sarah said casually, watching Clara in the mirror. "He is always whistling and smiling. I wonder what has changed." Clara felt her cheeks heat. I cannot imagine, cannot you? Sarah asked with a knowing smile. Clara, he cares for you deeply. I can see it every time he says your name, and I think you care for him too. Clara stopped pinning and met Sarah's eyes in the mirror. I do, she admitted. I care for him more than I probably should. We have not known each other long. Sometimes you just know, Sarah said wisely, despite being younger than Clara by 4 years. I knew with Thomas the first time he kissed me behind the schoolhouse when we were 14. Some things do not need time, they just are. Clara thought about that after Sarah left, thought about how right it felt to be with Pierce, how natural and easy. She had never expected love, had assumed it was not in her future, but here it was anyway, undeniable and growing stronger every day. The next time Pierce came to town, he brought something unexpected, a survey map of his property and detailed drawings of his house plans. He spread them across Clara's work table, pushing aside bolts of fabric to make room. I wanted to show you, he said, and there was nervousness in his voice. I wanted you to see what I am building, Clara, because I am not just building it for myself anymore. Clara's heart began to pound. What do you mean? Pierce took her hands, his rough fingers gentle on hers. I mean that I am falling in love with you, Clara Ashford. I know it is soon, and I know you might not feel the same way yet, but I need you to know that every nail I hammer, every board I place, I am thinking of you. I am building a home, Clara, a home I hope you might want to share with me someday. Tears sprang to Clara's eyes, and she found herself unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Pierce hurried on, words tumbling out in a rush. I know you have your shop, and I would never ask you to give that up. We could work something out. Maybe you could sew from home and only come to the shop a few days a week. Or we could move the shop to the ranch somehow. I do not have all the answers, but I know that I want to try. I want to build a life with you if you will have me. Pierce, Clara managed, and her voice came out choked with emotion. I am falling in love with you too. I have been since that first day when you came into my shop looking so uncomfortable surrounded by all those dresses. And yes, I want to see your house completed. I want to sit on that porch with you and watch the sunsets. I want all of it. Pierce pulled her into his arms, holding her close, and Clara felt his heart beating fast against her cheek. They stood like that for a long moment, just holding each other, and Clara felt something settle into place inside her, like a piece of herself she had not known was missing had finally been found. There is one more thing, Pierce said, pulling back slightly so he could see her face. I want to buy you more fabric. Clara laughed through her tears. Pierce Morgan, you have already bought me enough fabric for 5 dresses. But I want to buy you fabric for 10 more, 20 more. I want you to have every color, every texture. I want you to make yourself all the beautiful dresses you have ever dreamed of, and I want to watch you wear them. That is ridiculous, Clara protested, but she was smiling. Maybe, Pierce agreed, but it makes me happy. And Clara, you deserve to have things that are just for you. You deserve to be cared for and spoiled and loved. Let me do that for you. How could she argue with such sincerity? Clara found herself agreeing, and the next day Pierce took her to the general store again. This time they chose fabrics together, Pierce pointing out colors he thought would look lovely on her, while Clara selected textures she wanted to work with. They came away with another armful of packages. Soft pink cotton, deep purple wool for winter, cream-colored linen, striped muslin in blue and white, and more burgundy silk because the first piece had been so beautiful. Mr. Blackwell no longer raised his eyebrows at their purchases. In fact, he smiled knowingly and told Clara he was glad to see her doing something for herself for a change. Word spread through Rawlins that Pierce Morgan was courting Clara Ashford seriously, and the town watched their romance with interest and approval. Mrs. Henderson stopped by the shop to tell Clara that Pierce was a good man, and that she was happy Clara had found someone worthy of her. The banker, who held the notes on Clara's father's debts, mentioned in passing that Pierce had been asking about what Clara owed, and though he could not share specific numbers without Clara's permission, he wanted her to know that someone cared about her welfare. Clara was touched and embarrassed by the attention, but mostly she was happy. Happier than she had been in years, maybe happier than she had ever been. She worked on Sarah's wedding dress during the day and on her own dresses in the evening, and Pierce came to town 3 or 4 times a week, bringing gifts of flowers or food or simply his company. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing dreams and fears, building a foundation of friendship and trust beneath the growing passion between them. One evening in late June, as they sat together on the bench outside Clara's shop watching the sun set over the distant mountains, Pierce turned to her with serious eyes. "Clara, I need to tell you something. I paid off your father's debts." Clara froze, not sure she had heard correctly. "What?" "I went to the banker and asked what you owed," Pierce explained. "And then I paid it all. The shop is yours now, free and clear. I know you did not ask for this, and I hope you are not angry, but I could not stand knowing you were working so hard just to pay off old debts. You should be working for yourself, for your future." Clara did not know whether to laugh or cry or shout at him. "Pierce, that was thousands of dollars. That was your savings, your house money." "I have more," Pierce assured her. "I have been careful and I have been working extra jobs. The house will take a little longer to finish, but Clara, setting you free was worth more to me than boards and nails. You have been trapped for so long, and now you are not. Now you can choose what you want to do instead of what you have to do." Tears streamed down Clara's face, and she found herself shaking with the magnitude of what he had done. "I do not deserve this. I do not deserve you. You deserve everything good in this world," Pierce said fiercely, wiping her tears away with his thumbs. "And I intend to spend the rest of my life proving that to you, if you will let me." Clara kissed him then, properly kissed him for the first time, and it was like coming home and flying away all at once. Pierce responded with gentle passion, his arms coming around her and holding her like she was something precious. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Clara knew with absolute certainty that she wanted to spend her life with this man. "Marry me," Pierce said, the words tumbling out urgent and unplanned. "I know I do not have a ring yet, and I know the house is not finished, but marry me anyway, Clara. Be my wife. Let me take care of you and love you for the rest of our days." "Yes," Clara said without hesitation. "Yes, Pierce, I will marry you." They made plans quickly, deciding to have a simple ceremony in the Rollins church after Sarah's wedding. Clara would have 4 months to prepare, to finish the dresses she was making for herself, and to think about what kind of life she wanted to build with Pierce. They agreed that Clara would keep her shop, coming to town 3 days a week to take orders and do fittings, while working from the ranch house the rest of the time. It would mean long days, but Clara did not mind. She loved her work, and now she would get to do it without the crushing weight of debt hanging over her. Sarah's wedding day arrived in early August, and it was everything the young woman had hoped for. The church was decorated with wildflowers, and Sarah looked radiant in her cream silk gown, the lace Clara had chosen catching the light beautifully. Thomas wept when he saw his bride coming down the aisle, and there was not a dry eye in the church when they spoke their vows. At the reception held at the Double R Ranch, Clara danced with Pierce under lanterns strung between trees, and he whispered in her ear about their own wedding to come. Sarah hugged Clara tightly and thanked her for making her dream dress, and then she hugged her future sister-in-law and said she could not wait to have Clara as part of the family. Clara wore her burgundy silk dress to Sarah's wedding, and the compliments she received made her blush with pleasure. She had added delicate embroidery to the bodice, tiny flowers in silver thread that caught the light, and the dress fit her perfectly, showing off her figure while remaining modest and appropriate. Pierce could barely take his eyes off her all evening, and more than once Clara caught him staring at her with such open adoration that it made her heart race. After Sarah and Thomas left for their wedding trip to Denver, Pierce drove Clara back to Rawlins through the warm summer night. They talked about their own wedding plans, keeping them simple and intimate. Clara would make her own dress, of course, and she had already chosen the fabric. White silk overlaid with lace, elegant and timeless. "I cannot wait to see you in a wedding dress," Pierce said, his voice rough with emotion. "I cannot wait to call you my wife." "Only 3 more months," Clara reminded him. 3 months and then we begin our life together." Those 3 months passed in a blur of activity and anticipation. Clara finished several dresses for herself, building a wardrobe the likes of which she had never owned. She made practical day dresses and fancy evening gowns, warm dresses for the coming winter and light ones for summer. Pierce kept bringing her fabric, unable to resist whenever he saw a color or texture he thought she would like. Clara pretended to scold him for his extravagance, but secretly she loved it, loved that someone cared enough to think about what would make her happy. She made her wedding dress with painstaking care, every stitch perfect, every detail exactly as she envisioned it. The white silk glowed like moonlight, and the lace overlay was delicate as spider webs. She created a fitted bodice with a high neckline and long sleeves, and the skirt fell in graceful folds from her waist. It was simple but elegant, and when Clara looked at herself wearing it for the first time, she felt like the bride she had always secretly dreamed of being. Pierce's house was finished 2 weeks before their wedding, and he took Clara to see it complete for the first time on a crisp October afternoon. The porch was there, wide and welcoming, with chairs and a swing just as he had promised. Inside, the rooms were painted and the floors were polished, and furniture Pierce had built himself filled the spaces with warm wood tones. "What do you think?" Pierce asked nervously, watching Clara's face as she explored their future home. "I think it is perfect," Clara said honestly. "I think it is the most beautiful home I have ever seen." Pierce had even created a sewing room for her, with large windows for good light and shelves for storing fabric and supplies. A new treadle sewing machine sat in the corner, his wedding present to her, and Clara ran her hands over it reverently. "You thought of everything," she said, tears in her eyes again. She seemed to cry a lot these days, but they were happy tears, tears of gratitude and joy. "I thought of you," Pierce corrected. "Every decision, every detail, I thought about what would make you happy." Their wedding day dawned clear and cold, the November sky that brilliant blue that only appears in autumn. Clara dressed in her white silk gown, and Sarah helped her with her hair, pinning it up with flowers they had gathered despite the cold. Sarah was showing now, expecting her first child in the spring, and she glowed with happiness for her brother and her friend. The ceremony was simple, attended by only close friends and a few people from town. Clara walked down the aisle of the small church alone, her father gone and no one else to give her away. But when she reached the front and Pierce took her hand, she felt like she had finally found where she belonged. They spoke their vows clearly, promising to love and cherish each other through whatever life brought. When Pierce kissed her as his wife, Clara felt the last of her old fears and loneliness melt away. She was no longer alone. She no longer had to carry everything by herself. She had a partner, a love, a future filled with possibility. The reception was held at Pierce and Clara's new house, and friends from the ranch and town filled the rooms with laughter and music. Clara changed out of her wedding dress into one of the pretty day dresses she had made, and she and Pierce danced in their new parlor while someone played fiddle and others clapped along. When everyone finally left as the sun set, Pierce and Clara stood together on their porch, wrapped in blankets against the cold, watching the sky turn pink and gold. "Happy?" Pierce asked, pulling her closer. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Clara admitted. "Pierce, you have given me so much. Not just the fabric and the house and paying my debts, but you have given me myself back. You made me see that I deserve beautiful things, that I deserve to be cared for. I did not know I had forgotten that until you reminded me." "You have given me just as much," Pierce said seriously. "You have given me a home in more than just the physical sense. You have given me a future worth working toward and a reason to build something lasting. Clara, I love you more than I can express in words." "Then do not use words," Clara suggested, smiling up at him. "Show me instead." And Pierce did, kissing his wife thoroughly as the stars began to appear overhead and the Wyoming wind whispered around them. Their first months of marriage were blissful despite the challenges of adjusting to living together. Clara kept her shop in Rawlins, driving into town every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday to meet with customers and complete orders. The other days she worked from home, and she found she was actually more productive with fewer interruptions. Pierce's sewing room was perfect, and Clara loved looking out the windows at the land while she worked, watching the seasons change and the cattle moving across the range. Pierce continued bringing her fabric whenever he went to town, and Clara continued making dresses for herself and for her customers. Her wardrobe grew until she had more clothes than she had ever dreamed of owning, dresses in every color and style, practical and fancy, warm and light. She had a blue dress for Tuesdays and a green dress for Saturdays, and a yellow dress for church on Sundays. She had evening gowns she had not yet had occasion to wear and work dresses that made even mundane tasks feel special. But more importantly than the dresses themselves was what they represented. Each one was a reminder that she was valued and loved, that someone cared enough to want her to have beautiful things. Each dress was a small rebellion against all those years of self-denial, a celebration of her right to take up space in the world and be noticed and appreciated. Sarah gave birth to a healthy baby boy in late April, and Clara made tiny gowns for her nephew, delighting in working with such small patterns. Sarah and Thomas named him William, and Pierce was a devoted uncle, visiting often and holding the baby with surprising gentleness for such a big, rough man. "Do you want children?" Pierce asked Clara one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, something that had become their evening ritual. Clara thought about it carefully. "I do," she said honestly, "but I also want to keep working, at least for a while. I love making dresses, Pierce." "I do not want to give that up completely." "Then do not," Pierce said simply. "We will figure it out together. There is no rush, Clara. We have all the time in the world." But life had other plans. By midsummer, Clara realized she was expecting their first child. The news filled her with joy and trepidation in equal measure. She worried about how she would manage her work, but Pierce assured her they would find a way. "You do not have to do everything yourself anymore," he reminded her. "We can hire someone to help in the shop if needed. Or you can take fewer commissions. Whatever you want, Clara, we will make it work." Clara cut back on her shop hours as her pregnancy progressed, working mostly from home and only taking orders from her regular customers. She made clothes for her coming baby, tiny gowns and blankets, and continued making dresses for herself in larger sizes to accommodate her changing shape. Even pregnant, She refused to wear shapeless shifts. She made herself maternity dresses in pretty colors with careful construction that fit her figure while allowing room for her growing belly. Pierce was attentive to the point of being overbearing, constantly worrying about Clara working too hard or lifting anything heavy. She found his concern endearing even when it was frustrating, and she learned to let him help her more, to accept that she did not have to carry every burden alone. Their daughter was born in late March, arriving during a surprise snowstorm that left the world white and pristine. Pierce rode through the storm to fetch the doctor, and Sarah came despite the weather to help with the birth. The labor was long and difficult, but when Clara finally held her daughter in her arms, she thought she had never seen anything so perfect. They named her Grace because she felt like grace, like a gift Clara had not known she needed but could not imagine living without. Grace had Pierce's dark hair and Clara's hazel eyes, and from the beginning she was a calm, content baby who rarely cried and seemed happy to watch the world around her. Clara continued her dressmaking, though at a much reduced pace during Grace's first year. She found she could work while the baby napped, and Pierce helped in the evenings, watching Grace while Clara finished seams or added embellishments. They hired a young woman from town to help in the shop 2 days a week, taking measurements and helping customers choose fabrics, while Clara focused on the actual construction of garments. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Pierce worked the ranch, Clara made her dresses, and together they raised their daughter in the house Pierce had built with his own hands. The porch became their favorite gathering place, and many evenings found the three of them sitting together watching the sunset. Grace babbling happily in her father's arms while Clara worked on hand stitching. When Grace was 2, Sarah and Thomas had their second child, a daughter they named Rose. The cousins grew up close, playing together whenever the families visited. Pierce's house rang with laughter and life, filled with the sounds of children and friends and family. Clara never stopped making dresses for herself, and Pierce never stopped bringing her fabric. It became a running joke between them, this habit of his to return from every trip to town with at least one new piece of fabric. Clara's sewing room overflowed with bolts in every color and texture imaginable, and she teased Pierce that he was trying to buy out the entire inventory of every fabric store in Wyoming. "I just like seeing you happy," Pierce would say, unrepentant. "And you always smile when you get new fabric." It was true. Even after years of marriage, even with a room full of fabric and a wardrobe overflowing with dresses, Clara still felt a thrill of joy every time Pierce brought her something new. Because it was not really about the fabric itself, it was about what it represented. A man who loved her enough to pay attention to what made her happy, who wanted to keep giving her gifts even when she did not need them, who understood that sometimes love was expressed in small, consistent gestures rather than grand declarations. Their second child, a son they named Peter, arrived 2 years after Grace. He had Clara's brown hair and Pierce's easy temperament, and from the beginning he was fascinated by his father's work on the ranch. As soon as he could walk, Peter followed Pierce everywhere, trying to help with chores and asking endless questions about horses and cattle. Grace, meanwhile, showed an interest in her mother's work. She loved watching Clara sew, and by the age of 5 she was learning simple stitches, her small fingers struggling to control the needle but her determination fierce. Clara taught her patiently, remembering how her own father had taught her, and she felt the satisfaction of passing on skills to the next generation. The shop in Rawlins continued to thrive, though Clara no longer needed it for financial survival. Pierce's work at the ranch brought in steady money, and the land he owned was increasing in value as Wyoming continued to develop. But Clara kept the shop because she loved it, loved creating beautiful things and seeing the joy on women's faces when they saw themselves transformed by a well-made dress. She also continued making her own dresses, though she hardly needed more at this point. Her wardrobe was extensive and varied, filled with every kind of dress imaginable. But the act of creation itself was satisfying, and Clara found peace in the rhythmic motion of her needle, in the way fabric transformed under her hands from flat pieces into three-dimensional art. One autumn evening, when Grace was 7 and Peter was 5, the family sat together on the porch watching the sunset as usual. The children were playing with wooden toys Pierce had carved, and Clara was hand-stitching lace onto a new dress, this one a deep plum color that reminded her of ripe fruit. "You know what I realized today?" Pierce said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. "What?" Clara asked, setting aside her sewing to look at him. "You own more dresses now than any woman in Wyoming, probably, maybe in all of the Western Territories." Clara laughed. "That cannot possibly be true. What about the governor's wife, even her?" Pierce insisted, grinning. "You have been making dresses for yourself for 8 years now, and I have been bringing you fabric for just as long. Clara, you must own 50 dresses at least." 63, Clara admitted. "I counted last week." Pierce whistled low. 63 dresses. For a woman who did not own a single proper dress when I met her. "Thanks to you," Clara said softly, reaching for his hand. "Thanks to you, I have more beautiful things than I ever dreamed possible. But Pierce, the dresses are not even the most important thing you gave me." "No?" Pierce asked, squeezing her fingers. "No, you gave me back my life. You freed me from debt and fear and the belief that I did not deserve good things. You taught me that I could work hard and still take care of myself, that one did not preclude the other. You showed me what love looks like when it is freely given, with no expectation of return. The dresses are wonderful, but they are just symbols of all that." Pierce pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "You did the same for me, you know. Before I met you, I was just existing, working toward a goal without really understanding why. You gave me purpose, Clara. You gave me a reason to build a home instead of just a house. You made me understand what love actually means." Grace looked up from her toys. "Mama, are you crying?" "Happy tears, sweetheart," Clara assured her daughter, wiping her eyes. "Just very happy tears." As the sun disappeared below the horizon and the first stars appeared, Pierce told the children the story of how he met their mother, how she made beautiful dresses for everyone but never had any for herself, and how he decided to change that. Grace and Peter listened with rapt attention, even though they had heard the story many times before. "And now Mama has the most dresses in the whole world," Grace said with satisfaction. "And Daddy keeps bringing her more fabric," Peter added. "That is right," Pierce confirmed. "Because your Mama deserves beautiful things, and I intend to keep giving them to her for the rest of our lives." The years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children. Grace developed real skill with a needle, and by the time she was 12, she was helping Clara with simpler commissions in the shop. Peter, as expected, became a skilled ranch hand under his father's tutelage, though he also showed surprising artistic talent and sometimes carved small wooden figures that his mother displayed proudly on the mantelpiece. Sarah and Thomas had 3 more children, giving Grace and Peter a whole tribe of cousins to play with during family gatherings. The two families remained close, bound by blood and friendship and shared history. Sarah often joked that it was good Pierce had married Clara, because Sarah had gained not just a sister-in-law but also a dressmaker, and she never had to worry about having unfashionable clothes. When Clara turned 35, Pierce threw her a surprise party at their house, inviting friends from all over the county. Clara arrived home from the shop to find the house filled with people and decorations, and she was genuinely shocked. She had never been one for making a fuss over birthdays, but Pierce insisted she deserved to be celebrated. The highlight of the party was Pierce's gift, an entire bolt of the most exquisite silk Clara had ever seen. It was the color of deep water, blue-green and shimmering, and it must have cost a small fortune. Clara ran her hands over it reverently, already imagining what she could create from such spectacular material. "Pierce, this is too much," she protested, but she was smiling. "It is never too much," Pierce said firmly. "Not for you, never for you." Clara made an evening gown from that silk, her most ambitious project yet. She spent weeks on it, creating a masterpiece of construction and design. The bodice fit like a second skin, and the skirt fell in graceful folds that caught the light with every movement. She added delicate beading by hand, hundreds of tiny crystals that sparkled like stars. When it was finally complete, it was the most beautiful dress Clara had ever made, for herself or anyone else. She wore it to the county harvest ball that year, and the compliments she received were so numerous and effusive that she felt embarrassed. But Pierce beamed with pride beside her, and when they danced together in her spectacular gown, Clara felt like the luckiest woman alive. "Remember when you told me you never made dresses for yourself?" Pierce whispered as they waltzed. "Look at you now." "Look at us now," Clara corrected. "Everything good in my life came from the day you walked into my shop looking uncomfortable among all those dress forms." "Best decision I ever made," Pierce said. "Asking you to come to the ranch that day. If I had waited for Sarah's leg to heal before bringing her to you, who knows if I would have had the courage to court you properly." "I think you would have found a way," Clara said. "I think we were meant to find each other, Pierce. All those years of struggling alone, they were leading me to you." More years passed, and their children grew into young adults. Grace became an accomplished dressmaker in her own right, eventually taking over more and more of the shop responsibilities as Clara scaled back her work. Peter married a girl from a neighboring ranch and started his own place with Pierce's help, building his own house just as his father had done before him. Clara and Pierce became grandparents, first to Grace's twin daughters and then to Peter's son. The house that had once been so quiet and empty during Clara's first visit now rang with the sounds of family gatherings and celebrations. The porch Pierce had built with such care hosted 3 generations, and the swing he had hung there had worn smooth from decades of use. Through all of it, Pierce never stopped bringing Clara fabric. Even when they were in their 50s and Clara's hair had gone gray, and her hands sometimes ached from decades of sewing, Pierce still returned from every trip to town with a package under his arm. The pattern never changed. He would set the fabric down on her sewing table with a smile, and Clara would unwrap it with the same joy she had felt the very first time, back when she had owned only 2 faded work dresses and could not imagine having more. "You know I do not need any more fabric," Clara would say, but she was always smiling. "I know," Pierce would reply, "but I like giving it to you anyway." Clara's collection of dresses eventually numbered over 100, filling multiple wardrobes and a dedicated dressing room Pierce had added to the house. She had dresses for every occasion and season, in every color and style. She had work dresses and church dresses, day dresses and evening gowns, summer frocks and winter wools. She had dresses she wore regularly and dresses she wore only once or twice a year for special occasions. But every single one was special to her, because every single one represented love freely given and joyfully received. When Clara was 60, she finally decided to retire from the shop in Rawlins. Grace had been running it successfully for years, and Clara found she was ready to focus on her family and her home. She still sewed, of course. She could not imagine stopping completely. But now she made things purely for pleasure. Dresses for her granddaughters, quilts from scraps of all her old projects, embroidered handkerchiefs and delicate baby gowns. Pierce retired from active ranch work around the same time, turning over the day-to-day operations to younger men while he focused on managing the business side of things. He spent more time at home, and he and Clara returned to their old pattern of sitting together on the porch every evening, watching the sunset just as they had done since the very beginning. One summer evening, when the air was soft and sweet with the scent of wild roses, Clara sat on the porch working on a small dress for her newest granddaughter. Pierce was beside her in the swing, rocking gently and watching the sky turn colors. "Pierce," Clara said, setting aside her sewing. "Yes, love, thank you." Pierce turned to look at her, raising an eyebrow. "For what in particular?" "It is a long list at this point," Clara laughed. "For everything, I suppose, but particularly for the fabric. For all those bolts and pieces, all those colors and textures. For seeing that I needed something I did not even know I needed, and for caring enough to provide it." "You never needed fabric, Clara," Pierce said gently. "You needed to know you were worth caring for. The fabric was just the medium." "Perhaps," Clara agreed, "but it was the perfect medium. Every time you brought me fabric, you were saying I mattered. You were saying I deserved beautiful things and you wanted to be the one to give them to me. Do you know how powerful that is? To have someone consistently, year after year, show you that they value you." Pierce pulled her close, and Clara leaned against his shoulder, feeling safe and loved and complete. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me," he said quietly. "From that first day when I saw you in your faded green dress, working so hard to make beauty for everyone else, I knew you were special. I just wanted to be worthy of you." "You were always worthy," Clara assured him. "And you gave me a life beyond anything I imagined possible. You freed me from poverty and loneliness. You gave me a home and a family. You taught me that I could be both a skilled craftswoman and a woman who owns beautiful things, that taking care of myself did not mean neglecting my work. You balanced everything for me, Pierce. You balanced my whole life." They sat together as the sun disappeared and the stars came out. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful together. The house behind them was filled with memories and love, and the wardrobe inside held over 100 dresses in every color imaginable, each one a testament to a man who saw a woman working too hard in a faded dress and decided to change her life. As Clara dozed off against Pierce's shoulder, her last thought before sleep claimed her was that she was the richest woman in Wyoming, not because of the land or the house, or even the extensive wardrobe, but because she had spent her life loved completely by a good man who showed that love in countless small, consistent ways. The dressmaker, who never owned a dress herself, had become a woman who owned more dresses than she could wear, and every single one was a love letter stitched in cloth and thread, a reminder that she mattered, that she deserved beauty, that she was cherished beyond measure. And really, what more could anyone ask from a life than that? The years that followed were gentle ones, full of the quiet satisfactions of a life well lived. Clara and Pierce watched their grandchildren grow, celebrated anniversaries and holidays surrounded by family, and continued their evening ritual of watching sunsets from the porch that had become the heart of their home. Grace's dressmaking business thrived, and she eventually trained her own daughters in the craft, passing down the skills that had sustained the family through generations. Peter's ranch prospered, and he proved to have his father's eye for good cattle and land management. Both children built lives their parents could be proud of, and Clara and Pierce took deep satisfaction in knowing they had given their children a strong foundation. When Pierce turned 70, his health began to decline, though his mind remained sharp and his devotion to Clara never wavered. Clara cared for him tenderly, returning all the care he had shown her throughout their marriage. Even when movement became difficult for him, Pierce insisted on their evening porch ritual, and Clara would help him outside to watch the sunset together. "You have any regrets?" Clara asked him one evening when the sky was painted in brilliant shades of orange and purple. "Not a single one," Pierce said firmly. "Except maybe that I did not buy you more fabric." Clara laughed, tears in her eyes. "Pierce Morgan, I have enough fabric to make dresses for 3 lifetimes." "You have given me more than enough." "It was never enough," Pierce insisted, taking her hand. "You deserved everything, Clara. You deserved the whole world, and all I could give you was fabric and love." "The fabric was lovely," Clara said, squeezing his fingers gently. "But the love was everything. The love was all I ever really needed." Pierce passed peacefully in his sleep a few months later, Clara beside him in the bed they had shared for nearly 50 years. The funeral was attended by what seemed like half of Wyoming, all the people whose lives Pierce had touched with his steady kindness and quiet generosity. Clara bore her grief with the same grace she had shown throughout her life, finding comfort in her children and grandchildren, and in the memories of a marriage that had been happy beyond all expectation. In the months after Pierce's death, Clara found solace in her sewing. She created a memory quilt using scraps from all the dresses Pierce had bought her fabric for, each square a different color and texture, telling the story of their love through cloth. She stitched it together slowly, remembering the day Pierce had brought each piece home, remembering his smile and his insistence that she deserved beautiful things. When the quilt was complete, it was massive, covering her entire bed, a riot of color and pattern that somehow came together into a harmonious whole. Clara wrapped herself in it every night, feeling surrounded by Pierce's love even though he was gone. She lived for another 15 years after Pierce died, long enough to see great-grandchildren born and to watch Grace's dressmaking business expand to include a second location. Clara never remarried, never even considered it. She had been loved completely by one good man, and that was enough for a lifetime. She continued to sew until her hands became too stiff and her eyes too dim. And even then, she would sit in her sewing room running her hands over the bolts of fabric that still lined the shelves, remembering. Each piece held a story, a moment in time when Pierce had seen it and thought of her, when he had brought it home with hope and love. The house Pierce had built remained in the family, passing to Peter, who maintained it carefully, preserving the porch and the swing and the sewing room as a memorial to his parents' love. The dress shop in Rawlins stayed in the family too, run by Grace and then by her daughters, a multi-generational business built on the foundation of Clara's skill and hard work. Clara Ashford Morgan died peacefully at the age of 85, surrounded by family, in the house her husband had built for her. She was buried next to Pierce under a wide Wyoming sky, and her tombstone bore a simple inscription: "She made beauty, and she was loved." At the funeral, Grace stood up to speak about her mother, and she told the assembled crowd about the first dress Clara had made for herself, how she had worked all night to create something beautiful from the blue fabric a cowboy had bought her, how that dress had been the beginning of everything. She told them about Pierce's habit of bringing home fabric, about how he had never stopped even after Clara's wardrobe overflowed, about how that simple gesture had been his way of saying, "I love you," every single day. "My mother owned over 150 dresses when she died," Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. each one made by her own hands, from fabric my father chose for her. She went from being a dressmaker who never owned a proper dress herself to a woman who had more beautiful clothes than she could wear in a year. But the clothes were never really the point. The point was the love that they represented, the consistent care and devotion that my father showed her every single day of their marriage. She held up a piece of fabric, the last piece Pierce had bought before he died, a soft rose-colored cotton that Clara had never gotten around to making into a dress. This was his last gift to her. He brought it home 3 days before he died, and he told my mother he thought it would make her look beautiful, as if she needed anything external to make her beautiful. But that was how he loved her, by seeing beauty in her and wanting to give her beautiful things. Grace's voice broke, and she paused to collect herself. My mother kept this fabric untouched for 15 years after my father died. She never made it into a dress. She said she wanted to save it, to have one last gift from him that remained pure potential, all the possibility of what could be created, but choosing instead to preserve the moment of receiving it. I think that says everything about their love, about how much they meant to each other. The family gathered after the funeral at the house Pierce had built, and they found themselves naturally drawn to the porch, to the swing that had hosted so many evenings and conversations and quiet moments of shared love. They sat together as the sun set, watching the sky turn colors, and they told stories about Clara and Pierce, about the love story that had started with a cowboy buying fabric for a dressmaker who never owned a dress herself. The youngest great-grandchild, a girl of 6 named Clara after her great-grandmother, asked questions about the dresses and the fabric and the love story that sounded to her like a fairy tale. Her mother, one of Grace's daughters, pulled her onto her lap and explained, "Your great-great-grandfather saw that your great-great-grandmother needed something she would never give herself. So he gave it to her, over and over, year after year, until she finally understood that she deserved good things. And that is what real love looks like, sweetheart. It looks like paying attention to what someone needs and providing it consistently, without expecting anything in return. It looks like fabric in every color, bought by a cowboy for a dressmaker, transforming both their lives in the process." As the stars came out and the family began to drift inside, young Clara stayed on the porch a moment longer, looking at the house and the land and the vast Wyoming sky. She thought about the great-great-grandmother she had never known, about the dresses that still hung in wardrobes upstairs, about the love story that had shaped her family. Someday, she decided, she wanted a love like that. A love that saw her clearly and chose to give her what she needed even when she did not ask. A love that showed up consistently, day after day, year after year, in small gestures that added up to a lifetime of devotion. A love like fabric in every color, freely given and gratefully received. A love like the dressmaker and the cowboy, who found each other in a small Wyoming town and built something beautiful that lasted long after they were gone. That was the kind of love worth waiting for, worth working toward, worth believing in. And as young Clara finally went inside to join her family, the swing on the porch moved gently in the evening breeze, as if pushed by invisible hands, as if 2 people who had loved deeply were still sitting there together, watching the sunset and counting their blessings and grateful for every moment they had been given. The house Pierce built and the dresses Clara made became family legends, passed down through generations along with the story of how they came to be. The fabric shop in Cheyenne that had supplied Clara's materials for so many years eventually named a line of fabrics after her, calling it the Clara Collection in honor of the dressmaker who had turned simple cloth into art and into love letters all at once. The dress shop in Rawlins continued to thrive for generations, a testament to Clara's skill and vision, a place where women came not just for clothing but for transformation, for the experience of being seen and valued and made to feel beautiful. The seamstresses who worked there learned Clara's techniques and philosophy, understanding that they were not just making dresses but participating in something deeper, something about helping women recognize their own worth. And somewhere in heaven or wherever souls go after death, Clara and Pierce sat together on an eternal porch, watching eternal sunsets, surrounded by fabric in every color imaginable. Clara sewed while Pierce watched her with those warm brown eyes, and they were happy, endlessly happy, knowing that their love had not ended with death, but had transformed into something larger, something that touched everyone who heard their story and believed that love like theirs was possible. Because it was possible, it was real. A dressmaker who never owned a dress herself and a cowboy who bought her fabric in every color, two ordinary people who created an extraordinary love through simple, consistent acts of caring. That was their legacy, their gift to the world. Proof that love does not have to be complicated or dramatic to be profound. That sometimes the deepest love is expressed through the smallest gestures, repeated faithfully over a lifetime, until those gestures become the foundation on which everything else is built. Fabric in every color, a porch with a swing, sunsets watched together, a love that lasted forever and changed everything for everyone it touched. That was the story of Clara and Pierce Morgan, and it was a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth believing in, generation after generation, forever and always.